like to do today is to pick up the threads from where we were a week ago, last Monday, and to ask in this context that you add that assignment to your reading for this week, which says something about an additional assignment. This is it. We're going to be dealing next time, perhaps the time after, with realism in Britain and America in the early 20th century. And I'd like you to read about that either in Copleston, Volume 8, Chapter 17, you know, Copleston's History of Philosophy, or in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the article on realism. Okay. And once you've got that, then we'll come back to where we were on Monday. Namely this, that 19th century empiricism represented in your readings and in my comments by the Frenchman Auguste Comte, the Britisher John Stuart Mill, and the German, or is he Austrian, Ernst Mach. 19th century empiricism can be characterized in these three ways. First of all, the development of the hypothetico-deductive method in science. This is the way in which Enlightenment objectivity in empiricism begins to show itself. The problem with Enlightenment foundationalism was, of course, getting firm enough premises. Either Descartes' intuitive first principles, or empirical generalizations like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and others. Now, what happens in the thinking of the 19th century in these people is that the empirical generalization, while it cannot be inductively proven, is taken to be a hypothesis. And really, from an empirical standpoint, that's what it is. If we have a sample of only half of the class, then it's hypothetical that all the class has the same characteristics as that half we have a sample of. So you have a hypothesis then, an empirical generalization that functions as a hypothesis. Sometimes it's not even a hypothesis which has the degree of confirmation that would be available with empirical data. Sometimes it's simply a hypothesis that we have no direct confirmations of, you see, and is only confirmed indirectly by what we deduce from the hypothesis, you see. But the same pattern is there. Just as in the Enlightenment it was premise, deductive inferences to conclusion, the whole structure of foundationalism is initiated by Descartes, you see. And just as John Locke wanted to do that with what he called demonstrative knowledge, okay, from first principles, definitions, whatever, deducing. That sort of procedure, if you like, the mathematical method of deduction from premises, that carries over into science as the hypothetical deductive method. And you can see that, for instance, in John Stuart Mill, when he talks about the principle of induction, that enables you to generalize in terms of the uniformity of nature. The uniformity of nature is the hypothesis, the greatest empirical generalization of all. You see, you need that as a premise, the hypothetico-deductive method. Now, that method is extended by Comte into what became sociology, by Mill into political science and ethics. Extended, that is to say, into the study of humankind, human behavior, human society, social change, such like. So you have then this extension of the methods of natural science into the social sciences, as we call them. And that gives rise to what in Auguste Comte is called the unity of science, and in the 20th century is known as the unity of science movement. Now, I was commenting just now about what Evans said on Troeltsch. You see, Troeltsch would be part of that unity of science movement. He wants history to be amenable to the methods of the natural sciences, including causal explanations. He wants the scientific empiricism of the natural sciences to operate in understanding of history, you see. So this unity of science movement, John Dewey was very influential in that in the 20th century. In fact, his book on the theory of valuation, in which he develops most articulately his instrumentalism, was in a series of monographs called the International Encyclopedia of the Unified Sciences. Get that? The International Encyclopedia of the Unified Sciences, a series of monographs. So that extension to the human sciences then produced Comte, Mill's utilitarianism, so on and so forth. Now, the further thing, however, is that any kind of empiricism begins to have difficulty with metaphysics, as we well know from our friend David Hume. And so it's not surprising that this 19th century empiricism develops a phenomenalist, not phenomenological, keep those two separate, develops a phenomenalist position. And that's obvious in Comte, where he has those three stages in the evolution of any science, the first stage being religious, the second stage metaphysical, the third being science. And so empirical science has outgrown the need for metaphysical speculation. And likewise in Mill, where matter is simply described, defined in phenomenalist terms as the further possibility of sensations. And mind is the permanent possibility of reflections. You see, purely empirical definitions, phenomenalist definitions. Nothing about what mind is in itself, or matter is in itself. So there's some phenomenalist anti-metaphysical thing. And Mach, likewise, though he's a physicist, and therefore his emphasis is more on the first two of these. Now, this is what we were talking about last Monday. If you've not already done so, do read those selections from Gardner assigned for last week from Comte, Mill, and Mach. You'll find Comte and Mill pretty straightforward reading. Mach also. But Comte and Mill are the most important of the two. So do get acquainted with them. And I'm not going to spend further time on them, partly because there's only so much time, but partly as well because they're so readily intelligible. You've learned how to read for yourself by this time in the semester. You know, we don't have to expound step by step anymore like may have been necessary. Is that these three characteristics of 19th century empiricism are true also of Bertrand Russell. Yes, and in what comes out of Bertrand Russell, namely the work of the early Wittgenstein and logical positivism and certain types of analytic philosophy after logical positivism of Ayer. Okay. So you're going to be reading Ayer now as the source material. In reading Ayer, keep these three things in mind. That's the key to understanding what he's doing in the whole positivist movement. This is the subject matter for the seminar that's coming up in B Quad in the fall. What's it called? Recent analytic philosophy? Something of that sort, modern analytic philosophy. Yeah, starting with Russell. And then as you look at some of the people in our chapter in Stumpf, Carnap, Quine, the three biggies in the development of 20th century analytic philosophy. Well, in addition to Wittgenstein. Okay? So this is tremendously important stuff in shaping the positivist movement, in shaping the direction of philosophy of science until mid-century, the 50s, and in shaping the development of what has perhaps been the most influential philosophical movement in the West in the 20th century, scientific naturalism. Okay, a naturalistic philosophy oriented to the methodology and findings of natural science. Okay, these are the assumptions underlying it. Tremendously important. And if you want to understand that, you have to understand those 19th century guys, you have to understand Bertie Russell, and so forth. Incidentally, it may seem a jump from John Stuart Mill to Bertrand Russell, who died just, 20 years ago, maybe less than that, until you read, as you might someday, that John Stuart Mill was Russell's godfather. I'm not quite sure what godfather means for those of such little religious persuasion, but at least there was a formal relationship, if not a religious one in that sense. Okay, so their lives at least overlapped a wee bit for that to be possible. Is, I think, of lasting importance for his logical atomism. That's the thing that Stumpf emphasizes, and rightly so. Now, he did a lot more besides. His initial interest was in mathematics and logic. He started out as a mathematician, cooperated with Whitehead when they were both at Cambridge, cooperated with Whitehead in writing Principia Mathematica. Affectionately known as PM. That PM means three different things in Britain: afternoon, Prime Minister, and Principia Mathematica. Okay? Now, for Russell, the PM was really the launching of his major influence and career. In it, he and Whitehead showed that mathematics is essentially the same as logic, in that they are both formal logical systems. Now, what we mean by formal logical system is simply a deductive system, a system that has the form of a deductive system, okay? Like we're familiar with in Euclidean geometry, where from the initial axioms you deduce the theorems, and from the conclusions of various theorems you deduce further theorems, and so on and so forth. The idea is that mathematics, arithmetic, or as well as geometry, can all be formalized as deductive systems. And what they developed was symbolism. Algebraic symbolism for